Good morning, YouTube. Eric in the garden. Doing some weeding today and quite frustrated with the weeds themselves. We mentioned that we went away for vacation for about 2 weeks. Prior to that, the garden was in pretty good shape. We've mulched with pine mulch, did a little roundup in between the beds, but this is one of the unintended consequences of drip irrigation. Again, I just weeded this bed, so it didn't take too long, but it's still quite frustrating to spend so much time weeding. I've made the watering efficient and things like that. Before we get to the bad news or the frustrating news, if you don't have Crescendo, you need to get that in your garden. This is from K&M in terms of on Fortuniana rootstock, but you can get Crescendo through many vendors. But this is a small bush right now. It's not super vigorous. One of the parents is Gemini, and it doesn't grow as quite as tall as Gemini. It's more a squatty bush, but almost every bloom looks like that with a pinpoint center, great color, and it has a light fragrance. So I highly recommend that. So this is the bed I just did. I'm leaving these weeds there because they're well away from the bushes, so I'm going to spray Roundup on them. But I mentioned unintended consequences. This is Marilyn Monroe. Again, it's small. It just got planted a couple weeks ago as a Fortuniana rootstock as its base. But you can see my drip irrigation down here, and unfortunately most of the weeds that have sprung up the last couple weeks are right around the drip irrigation. That makes sense because we've been extremely dry and that's the only area getting watered. The frustrating part is I don't have as many weeds away from the rose bushes, and that's frustrating because my plan was just to do a little nominal hand weeding around the rose bush itself and then spray the rest of the bed. But with the majority of the roses or the weeds being right by the rose, I can't do that. Here's another example. This is Dolly Parton. This just got planted. So in between the beds, not a lot of weeds because again, it's not getting watered. The drippers are right by the rose itself, and lo and behold, I have a nice piece of crabgrass starting. So a little frustrating. What do you do with your weeds? That seems to be the one thing I can't quite tackle in terms of keeping ahead of. The bed's not overgrown by any stretch, but it definitely is not as clean as I'd like it to be. On the plus note, our fragrance bed is doing well. This is Fragrant Cloud. That's doing quite well. Over here we have Secret. I've never grown that before, but that has a nice light fragrance, and you'll notice that some of the blooms are smaller because of our heat. And here's another one, Pope John Paul II, a nice bloom with fragrance. So that's doing quite well. And then some of the old standbys, you've got Dolly Parton there. This is established. This is Mr. Lincoln from last year. And in the back right corner is Double Delight. One of the biggest roses in the garden is actually on own root. And I'll do a video on what own root is versus Fortuniana or Multiflora, or even some of the other rootstocks that folks use. This is on its own roots. This is Yolande de Aragon. It's old garden rose. It is a repeat bloomer. Most of the blooms come in spring, but it should have another flush here as we head toward fall. So that's our update. This is the bed we just have completed. I'm going to get back to weeding. I think I am going to try to spray as much as I can because this is a pretty daunting task in terms of getting the beds cleaned up. What do you do to stay ahead of it? If you have drip, have you noticed, you probably have, the weeds kind of congregate where your drippers are? I don't think there's much you can do about that other than hand weeding. These are some of the bushes I'll end you with. These are more established ones. This is Hot Princess in the foreground. Veterans Honor there, approaching 6 feet tall, and it's July. So these will be 8 or 9 feet by the fall if I don't prune them for the rose shows, which I'll probably do, so they won't get that tall. Thanks again for commenting on the page. Curious what you folks do for weeds. I'm gonna get to the spraying, and again, you can see the results. Spraying does help, but you can't spray right by the rose itself. I'll last leave you with this nice spray, no pun intended, of Jewel Grace.